Hi, Toby. Thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background and what your research entails?
Sure. So my name is Toby Shulruff, and I'm based on the west coast of the US. I started in the field of gender-based violence in the late 90s, and specifically at the intersection of technology and gender-based violence in 2003. I was part of a founding cohort trained by Cindy Southworth, who founded the Safety Net Project at the National Network to End Domestic Violence here in the US. And she, at that time, was trying to train up someone in every US state and territory to be able to address tech abuse specific to gender-based violence. And I happened to be in Washington State at the time, which is home to Microsoft and Boeing, and so had a more technology forward than most state government and set of funding for both domestic violence and sexual assault services there. And so they in turn funded a sort of roadshow between myself and two other trainees to train up everybody in every county of Washington State. And so immediately sort of deliver on that. I also began working on technology abuse policy issues along with our director at that time. And so kept that role for a few years before moving to work directly for the safety net team, which I did for just a bit more than a year, and due to family illnesses needed to step back. Did policy analysis for state government in Washington State, a lot of that technology based, across a range of issues as criminologists. It wasn't just from the survivor side, it was also in terms of sex offender management issues, similar human trafficking task force issues as well. And then continued to work in the nonprofit space primarily and with Safety Net, but just not directly for them, all the way up into the present. I went back to work for them full time in 2016 and was there for about 7 years before leaving to be in the PhD program that I'm in now. So over that time, I had two sort of questions in my mind. One was, does technology have to be the way that it is? Like, is it inevitable because of its military industrial roots in surveillance and control and, threat, basically, that while that's enacted sort of on a national or a corporate level, like that's also happening on the micro level in interpersonal relations. And so I wondered if that was inevitable or if there were different ways that we could design technology. That led me to a master's of science degree in public interest technology, and to be connected to All Tech is Human, which I know you are as well, to sort of get involved in the responsible tech, tech for good space, to say, can we change the design of tech, not just in the public sector, but also in terms of how that's enacted in the private sector. Um, and then specifically for that, I began the research that you saw the webinar for, which was looking at that trust and safety space. Over the years, Safety Net was one of the pioneering NGOs to start working with technology companies, specifically their trust and safety teams, in terms of really lifting up and escalating issues that we were hearing about in the field, whether that was, people's maps, location tracking being turned on without their knowledge and needing to be able to figure out how to get rid of that, to all sorts of other issues. And so that is the research again that you saw in that webinar. Since I finished the master's, I left to begin a consulting practice, which includes work for Safety Net, but also the UN Population Fund, work that they are doing to create guidance and internal processes around the safe and ethical use of technology, as well as some consulting for trust and safety teams and other nonprofits around these issues. My PhD research continued the trust and safety research, as well as some other more future-oriented research at World Expos. Let's see, is there anything else that's particularly relevant? Oh, and I've been consulting on some research projects as well in terms of US-based research and then some cross-border research collaborations around femtech or technology that's designed for women, whether that's period trackers or connected sex toys, in terms of privacy and safety of those.
Great. Thank you so much just for the whole rundown of your background and all your research and work that you've done in this space. Sounds really, really important and really exciting too, especially starting the PhD. I just wanted to touch on what you said about going to the area of trust and safety. In terms of, I guess, the biggest hindrance or potentially roadblock in this area of trust and safety, what do you think is the kind of biggest barrier in terms of access, like to data from platforms, transparency in platforms too, and potentially upholding, ethical or responsible kind of AI, and also, yeah, holding people's privacy in an ethical way as well?
Sure. Well, I mean, I suspect that you will talk to many other experts and activists who are perhaps more engaged in trying to get transparency reporting from companies. That's not the main area of my research, but I would say from the perspective of understanding innovation, design, technology design, from that public interest technology lens on responsible innovation, a huge barrier to not just like from the side of saying companies, why don't you give us information, but to companies sharing that information and to sharing information with each other. Let me back up. So thinking about examples like during COVID, the collaboration between Apple and Google to do COVID detection, or a more recent and specific to the area that I work in, their collaboration to try and make it easier for people to determine if there are small Bluetooth location trackers tracking them. Those kinds of collaborative initiatives, as well as their transparency reporting and their efforts to address trust and safety, are really hampered by just the nature of capitalism, right? Like competitiveness. It in some cases is that the teams outside of trust and safety are concerned that sharing that information could hamper the profits of a company. Like, I mean, that's definitely sort of the most obvious tip of the iceberg piece. But then there's also pieces where I've had conversations with trust and safety people who say, we want to have that direct conversation with the other company about this safety issue that doesn't really have a profit impact, but we're concerned about antitrust um, regulations. So I think that through really important efforts on behalf of society and regulators to try and control the direction of technology, like those are all super important things, but sometimes those can have consequences which make it difficult for companies to collaborate and to be transparent around the kind of work they're doing. So it isn't just that they're the big bad guys. I mean, maybe they are, but there's also like structural reasons that those are in place. And I think it's important to look at it with that nuance when we're developing strategies from an NGO or academia side to say, like, we want to see better results for society, for people and planet. Like, we need to understand that it's nuanced and it isn't just like the big bad monopolies. Like, it's complicated, and there's a ton of tiny little startup companies which don't wield the power of a Google or an Amazon or whatever, but who are still sort of hindered because they're just trying to get into the marketplace. And I think you see that really with IoT tech when it comes to smart home or connected cars or Bluetooth trackers, any of those things. It's like there's such a rush to market, right? And there's such a global economy and set of like companies involved in supply chain that it can be really difficult to like pin down where the security or safety concern is. So I won't ramble on further about that, but I see that that's a real issue. One other thing that I want to point out that came from participation in research collaboratives and coalition conversations that happened at the first Stanford Trust and Safety Conference, and that I've heard subsequently as well in being involved with the Trust and Safety Foundation's research collaborative work, is that just transparency isn't really enough, right? Like you can say big company X, hand over all of your records, but when it comes to trust and safety, like let's just walk through the flow of that. So it's like, all right, I user have something bad happen to me or see something I don't like. I make a report, usually through flagging something if we're talking about social media. Like it goes up the chain. Maybe nowadays automation AI handles some of that. Some of it goes to a human reviewer because it's escalated or it's nuanced, or it's complicated, or it goes to like a gig worker or a ghost worker, right? Like somewhere in that system, some determination is made. Maybe I get feedback, maybe I don't. Maybe I'm having like nude images of myself shared, and that isn't an option in the drop down menu. So I choose terrorism because this is really impacting my life. It feels like terror to me, and I want to like escalate it up there. So what happens to those data sets is they're super messy, right? Like they're not clean cut. People may enter the wrong thing. It may not be in the interface in a language that works for them. My point is, like, if you just turn over a whole raw data set, it's hard to make sense of that data. So just transparency isn't enough. It has to be like data that we can actually make sense out of. And I think that's where, and this is the tricky part, right? Because some companies are more or less willing to share that data. Some collaboration between particularly academic researchers or researchers who have some sort of parameters around what data they're sharing, who are able to get into the raw data and make sense of it with like internal researchers, can get you to better accountability data that can help us again to have that nuance to make sense of how to actually like leverage policy changes to get greater safety. That's my whole long answer to that.
No, that was a very, very good answer to our question. So thank you. Thank you so much for your insights. I have a follow-up, and you did mention a couple of these, you did touch on some of these points. So our question is, what does an ideal digital world look like for you? And based on the research that you've done, and is there anything that platforms or companies that are doing they're doing good now but could be improved on? If you could provide perhaps one short-term suggestion and a long-term suggestion on the back of that first question as well.
Well, sure. I mean, I came of age in technology like in the 80s and 90s when there was still a lot of enthusiasm for like the amazing like solidarity and freedom and like liberation that would be possible on the internet. And I think that yeah, through a variety of things, which have all been well charted by historians of the internet, like that went sideways. I would say that one of the biggest challenges is operating in a system of capitalism, right? Like that, and I don't just mean this like a straight up Marxist analysis. I'm saying like as long as we're saying that it's really difficult to have online communities that aren't generating some kind of income or have some kind of venture capital backing or business model which harvests people's data to be able to or their attention or whatever that like within those structures, it's really difficult to have an online safe online world, and not just safe but like generative, creative space where people can really connect with each other. And that even if we removed those pieces though, you'd still have bad actors, right? Like we're not going to have a utopian online world. There will always be people who are taking advantage of other people or who are just misunderstanding each other and not behaving respectfully to each other in a way that the other person desires, right? So to me, I think that having more spaces which are generated and created and crafted by people who have been on the margins of power is super important, whether that's women or indigenous communities or LGBTQ communities. I think that those spaces are just vital and critical. So it's that, the users of a space have a role in governing that space and not just governing it, but designing it, right? Like, I think this is where that tech design question comes in. It isn't like, are you doing user experience research once you've designed a project and you just want to know whether you should be pink or orange in your background color, but like from the outset, not even earlier than ideation, from problem definition. Like, do I need another widget to do XYZ? Or like, are we actually investing with communities? And I think especially looking at this work with the UN Population Fund, I'm thinking about it through a development context, an empowerment context, a sexual and reproductive health rights context. It's like, what do people most directly impacted by a problem need? And like, have them define the solution that they want. So I think that's a big shift that could even happen within structures that are making profit or whatever. I think that another piece too is just changing the definitions of like this freedom of speech issue, which I mean comes up in the US, but really comes up worldwide. You know, it generally excuses like nasty troll-like behavior that harms people, but we really, I think, shifting that to a rights-based frame of saying um, that participation in public platforms is a right, and that people who have been excluded by all sorts of systems of power continue to be excluded by technological systems of power, and that needs to flip. So freedom of speech means also that people who haven't had a voice or been excluded need to have space for their voice. And this is building on, you know, one of my interviewees from my research, but really just saying it's not just how do we stop bad things from happening, but how do we promote good things, right? Like, what if instead of weighting reactions towards outrage in social media platforms, we were rating them towards rewarding when you lift someone up, when you like highlight someone else's work, when you form positive connections, when, you know, those kinds of things happen. So more pro-social behavior and embedding that in the design of products.
Thank you so much. And I know obviously you've been working in the gender-based violence space for a long time. So it's interesting to hear about, you know, bringing that with the intersection of technology, so more tech facilitated gender-based violence. And you did speak a bit about marginalized communities, so whether they need to be more part of the process, and also engaging with them more. What do you think are the steps to actually do that? If you can be, I guess, a bit more specific in terms of like, how do we get them on board, whether they are willing to come forward and have like a safe space. And I know anonymity is something that I guess these communities use to their advantage to have their own little online spaces, safe spaces. I was wondering if you could speak to that, or if you had any thoughts on that at all.
Sure. So I think, you know, some of that, and none of these are like universal cures to things, but thinking about open source tools, um, you know, I'm thinking about, I was in Cholula, Mexico, summer 2022 at a conference between Latin American researchers and broader like science and technology scholars. And I had this amazing conversation with a feminist activist in Costa Rica who's doing work with an indigenous community to set up their own intranet. They didn't want to be part of the broader intranet, but they wanted to have their own connectivity, computer literacy, so that their kids, particularly their girls, would have those skills to be able to go out and work outside the community, or to use those tools to their benefit within their own community for weather monitoring, agriculture, like just communication, for social supports, for resource sharing, all of those things. And they, instead of coming in and saying, hey, let's install this for you, started from that place of saying, what is your problem definition? You know, what is it that you want? And it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it was going to be its own intranet, but that's ultimately what the community decided to do. So I think that it's rethinking a lot of our assumptions. Like, is it that we're, or, you know, another example is like Indigenous language speakers in New Zealand, and saying like they wanted to create a database for, I mean, what do they call it? Low resource languages, I think is the euphemism that's used. Not all communities want to be using Google Translate or to have the major platforms with access to their language. And so maybe it's setting up their own server, maybe it's setting up their own intranet, right? So some of the, I'm not a huge fan of the ideas of decentralization as they've sort of manifested on a large scale, but maybe it's stepping back and just saying like how, again, starting from like the problem definition, partnering with communities, building relationships, getting away from hackathons, parachuting in, and all these sorts of ideas where from the outside we're coming into communities, and instead saying like, here's a suite of resources, here's a suite of open source, here, like, let's fund your participation in RightsCon or other like international conferences where people can come together and discover what possibilities are and bring that back to their communities. So I think it's more of like honoring that like localized decision making. So I'm trying to be concrete about an answer to your question, but I think it really is about saying, how do we get the resource flow of like the massive companies and the huge infrastructure and the technological know-how, the flow in without parachuting in, without hackathons, without imposing models on other people or doing off-the-shelf things, and instead also letting communities know if this is something you want, like here's what's available to you, here's how you connect with those resources. Maybe that's more grant programs, maybe that's, as I say, more options of solidarity and cross-sharing and cross-pollination through conferences, both online and in person. Maybe it's ambassador trips. Like, I really think the entire development framework of being top-down really mirrors the Silicon Valley model of tech being top-down, right? And there's a lot of interweaving of that history, and I think it just needs to be turned on its head and be led from communities without every community having to reinvent the wheel. Like, I think that's where that resource sharing is super awesome, to be able to say, like, hey, we tried it this way, would that work for you, or something like that work for you, right? So I don't have a super concrete answer to that because I feel like it needs to be tailored to each community. I think another place that does that really well is Caravan Studios out of TechSoup, and TechSoup is a really interesting organization that way as well. Are you familiar with them? So they are a nonprofit that helps NGOs across the world in almost every country to access both hardware and software resources at a discount. So they serve sort of as a broker. So like the Microsofts of the world can say, we have, 1 million licenses that you can disperse to NGOs for them to use. And they help to they sort of vet and they provide consultation to those NGOs in making use of those tools. And then they operate the you just order the things and they show up for you. And so they have a side project called Caravan Studios where they do this sort of design and build process that again starts from calling a community meeting, no technology present, like you're really with sheets of paper on a table using markers to map out what the problem is and then start to prototype something, and then they take it and turn it into like the wireframe and the prototype, whatever, but it started from the community's needs. And they have developed a facilitation model for doing that. They've done it like Japan, Brazil, the US prior to the pandemic. I'm not sure what their most recent projects have been. Because obviously a lot of their resource got, redirected over during the pandemic. But that's a great model as well.
Thank you so much, Toby. I'm just drawing upon a thread that you had previously mentioned about smaller tech companies and startups as well. One of the questions I have is how smaller to medium-sized tech companies or businesses that are probably at a smaller scale and not, big tech platforms and those who hold a lot of money and power and infrastructure. How do you think that they can effectively integrate safety into their solutions or the adoption of new technologies? And do you see this actually being met with any resistance, or will it be an easy adoption process for them from now with your research and probably, I would say, 5-10 years in the future?
Yeah, I think even just in the few years that I've been doing this research, I've seen it shift in a positive direction in this way. During the wave of big big tech layoffs that happened, I had been tracking job postings, and I think I mentioned this in the webinar or not, maybe I did, but and I noticed that there was I expected to see a vast reduction in the number of job postings out there, and instead it held steady. But what did shift was that it was smaller, newer companies hiring rather than the bigger, older companies hiring. And what I hear from like being at TrustCon recently is that is a trend in the field, that like companies, even small startups, I don't want to overstate this because I don't have a good sense of this like on a global level, and this is anecdotally what I'm hearing from the field, not so much like research that I've done. I just want to be clear about that. Is that there's a greater recognition that trust and safety needs to happen. There's a greater awareness, at least for companies that are operating in the Europe or the US, that and Australia as well with the e-safety commissioner, like there's just a greater awareness that regulation is coming beyond fraud and privacy and things like that. And so to kind of get ahead of that. That said, the barriers that those companies are facing is that it can be tremendously expensive to hire people to do that work or to be recreating it themselves. And I think there's some effort on behalf of the Trust and Safety Professional Association, like All Tech is Human and places like that to kind of organize some efforts to come up with more open source, off the shelf resource library, like some sort of startup kits for startups around trust and safety work. But they're still likely to be under-resourced human-wise. I think another trend in that direction is that there's a lot more like BPOs and outsourcing of some of that work, whether that's fact checking or content moderation, but it really has to go beyond just social media, right? Like trust and safety needs to pertain to cars and it needs to pertain to your living room nowadays because of convergence. And so I think that another challenge there is that you have a lot of legacy companies that have been around for decades or 100 years that are suddenly becoming internet connected with their products. And they have done product safety for a long time, but they haven't thought about it in a digital realm, right? So it's getting them up to speed around the IT angle of it, not just from a like national security, cybersecurity angle, but thinking about cybersecurity in a broader sense, including feminist senses and privacy senses. And then it's for the smaller startups, getting them access to like some off-the-shelf resources and advice and networking with more established companies. And then for the big companies, it's like maintaining their commitment to actually do trust and safety work and not just be laying people off as if it's an afterthought.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all your insights. It's been a really, engaging and interesting conversation. So thank you.